Moving pictures that actually move us to feel and act. The advent of moving pictures and recorded voices, radio, film, television, and multimedia, and how they have been used to move people through propaganda and education. What's the context for these lectures? By the end of the 1800s, the innovations of the Lumiere brothers and Edward Muybridge and Thomas Edison started making pictures move. Picture books could suddenly come to life. The Disney era of moving storyboards, of animated comic books, of living fables, and of talking animals and other people, to quote the title of a book by my uncle Seamus Culhane, who animated Pluto and the Dwarves in Snow White, was set into motion. The stasis of the past few thousands of years, the equilibrium of the thinking out loud epics of human history, was punctuated with an exclamation point. An evolutionary saltation was taking place that would truly bring stories told about history and stories told from fantasy to life. It also contained not a few question marks. With the development of moving pictures, the possibility for propaganda also became clear to many who were interested in promoting their own visions of the world and wanted to force others to conform. Adolf Hitler's early job was as a propagandist, and he excelled at it. To counter the Nazi propaganda war machine, Disney and his team were hired by the US military to make their own counter-propaganda films using emotive music and sound effects and animation and every literal and figurative bell and whistle that Hollywood could provide. Later, Disney was hired by the government to promote things like nuclear power with the same techniques.
So the atom creates more food for our ever-growing population. And these same rays are the tools of atomic medicine.
And we all know how Madison Avenue used moving pictures and jingles to create a consumer culture of shoppers who, after seeing the latest cereal or soap or automobile advertisement, felt they just had to have whatever they saw and heard on the screen.
Nice to see ya. Sure knows how to start his day a little bit better.
You bet your booties, Granny. It's sugar-sweet and honey-flavored wheat, so it keeps me going strong. Thanks, Granny. Can't get enough of that Sugar Crisp.
He could have gotten Sugar Crisp in Post-10s, too. Post-10s has all the cereals kids want.
With this lecture, we see how filmmakers and educators have been at times empowered and at times disempowered to serve or reject the agendas of power holders. And students learn how you, too, can harness that power or fight against its effects. But most importantly, through historical context, we want to empower you to harness these techniques to spread your message, hopefully of substance sustainability, to an ever wider public. Our first reading touches on a point I've made often before, but want to re-emphasize emphatically. Gender, race too, or rather ethnicity and geographical origin and cultural background, since race isn't really a valid concept. Regardless, when we think out louder, using techniques that are able to grab people by the viscera and shake them up, using media that can now amplify voices in ways that trigger the amygdala and embed themselves in the limbic system and associate with the fight or flight response, we have a huge responsibility to respond and be able to steer the action toward love, peace, and understanding and sustainability. We have to. So one of our readings in this module is Of Posthuman Born, Gender, Utopia, and the Posthuman in Films and TV. Because the way that we see each other and our role in the future is radically influenced by the films we've been seeing all these decades. Fortunately, things are improving. All you have to do is watch, as my wife and I did one weekend recently, all 6 of the Terminator movies back to back. In 1984, Sarah Connor was a dolled-up, poofy-haired waitress who lived to go to the disco and had to be saved from annihilation by a male hero from the future. By the second movie, 7 years later, she was transforming into a bit of a badass warrior, fighting to protect her son against male-gendered robots from the future. By the third movie, a decade later, her son is being pursued by a female killer robot from the future and gets his butt kicked by a woman veterinarian who eventually becomes his wife. In the fourth movie, another decade later, the men and women fighting the robots in the future are on an equal footing. In the fifth movie, made in the next decade, we go back in time to a world of the 1980s in which Sarah was always a warrior since the age of 9 and never went through her disco partying waitress phase at all. By the 7th movie, the leader of the resistance is a Mexican woman who has no intention of being the mother of the hero, but fights alongside a cyborg woman to make all girls and women heroes of liberty forever. Even Sarah Connor is back as a wise warrior elder. The point is, of course, that fiction lays the groundwork for new realities. Isaac Asimov wrote, "Today's science fiction is tomorrow's science fact." And in fact, much of what we imagine in fiction has the potential to become fact once enough people accept the art as a version of reality worth pursuing. It becomes a far more possible thing when we are dealing with issues of gender, race, and class, since there are socio-political barriers to justice and equality rather than technical barriers. But even many technological fictions can become real if we dedicate ourselves to solving the crossover problem that plagues the borderland between dreams and reality. The submarines and airships of Jules Verne and the moon rockets of H.G. Wells became reality. Whether the Invisible Man and the Time Machine do or not is still a matter of speculation. But what we do know is that reality is evolving and that art and imagination help it to evolve. Like the work of E.O. Wilson that we explore in this course, our book, The Art Instinct, Beauty, Pleasure, and Human Evolution by Dennis Dutton, does a great job of emphasizing how difficult it is to understand art and fiction without contextualizing it in the theater of evolution, and how everything falls into place once we do. In Chapter 6, The Uses of Fiction, Dutton says, quote, "The ability to imagine scenarios and states of affairs not present to direct consciousness must have had adaptive power in human prehistory. Imagination allows the weighing of indirect evidence, making chains of inference for what might have been or what might come to be. It allows for intellectual simulation and forecasting, the working out of solutions to problems without high-cost experimentation in actual practice. Pentagon strategists engage in elaborate war games in which imagined plans of action are proposed and outcomes induced. In this respect, war gamers are in a line that extends back to the Pleistocene hunter-gatherer band that imagined what food was likely available in the next valley and weighed heading in that direction against envisioned risks and opportunity costs of doing so. This capacity for strategic, prudential, conditional thinking gave to such bands a vast adaptive advantage over groups that could not plan with imaginative detail." Page 106. You have to wonder then, given the selective advantages conferred by imagination, why it has been so heavily discouraged in school and in the way we teach the sciences in particular. Dutton is clear that, quote, "by allowing us to confront the world not just as naive realists who respond directly to immediate threats or opportunities, the general condition of other animals, but as supposition makers and thought experimenters, imagination gave human beings one of their greatest evolved cognitive assets." For Tullian Cosmides, quote, "it appears as if humans have evolved specialized cognitive machinery that allows us to enter and participate in imagined worlds," end quote. They call this capacity decoupled cognition. That's from page 106. The supposedly rational criticism of allowing imagination free rein in academic subjects is, of course, that we don't want students confusing reality and fiction. It would lead to a belief in fake news, right? There must be clear boundaries between fact and fiction if we are to progress as a species, yes or no? The short answer is no, not at all. One of the two major problems is religious, both are political. The religious problem is that in order to preserve its power and authority, church or synagogue or mosque bound Judeo-Christian Islam felt threatened by the theory of evolution because it challenged their mythologies about creation and found ways of excising it or forbidding it in school curricula. American school children and high school and college students in particular are so confused about what evolution is, much less how it operates, that they can't apply its principles to rational understanding of process, and so completely miss how reality works. The political issue at the heart of this are the desire to keep people from true critical thinking, from both ignorance of method and hostility or suspicion of the real value of fiction. And anybody who understands evolutionary psychology or who has worked with children knows that there never has been any danger of the young confusing reality and fiction. That difficulty is developed later in life through the very school system that forbids playful inquiry. Even Aristotle, in his Poetics, referred, quote, both to the universality of children's imitative play and to the universality of the pleasure felt in seeing imitations, quote, end quote, Setubi and Cosmides, quoted in Dutton. And they point out that, quote, pretend play, exhibited as a part of normal child development, requires breathtakingly subtle mechanisms to decouple the play world from the real world and from other play worlds. It's not that the true-false distinction is abandoned in play, but that the play world is bracketed off and truth becomes truth for the play world. Adults stereotypically think of small children as prone to confuse fantasy with reality, pretend play with the real world, but as the researcher Alan M. Leslie discovered, quote, children can invoke consistent rules and limitations within freely invented yet coherent fantasy worlds. What's more, children are also able with remarkable accuracy to keep fantasy worlds separate from one another and to quarantine multiple imaginary worlds from the actual life of the real world. They can tag the play world facts to separate play worlds and distinguish them from real-world activities. In this way, the natural appearance of pretend play is accompanied with an equally natural ability to distinguish fantasy from reality, end quote, page 107. In healthy adults, this evolved capacity, of course, persists, and adults understand that fictions are made up out of sets of propositions, quote, that are all tied together but are walled off from what the child knows to be true of the real world, and thus prevented from migrating into factual knowledge and corrupting it, end quote. The problem occurs when this decoupling mechanism is damaged by school systems that don't allow children to continue to develop and strengthen their understanding for how imagination can aid them in bettering their lives, which is what it evolved for in the first place. It was, after all, our supreme adaptation. End quote. Dutton gives us a clear warning for the consequences of prolonged lack of imagination that I hope will haunt all the earnest truth seekers out there who think it is folly to indulge in fantasy. Quote, suppose for a moment that human beings only and exclusively took pleasure in what they took to be true narratives, factual reports that describe the real world. Such Pleistocene Gradgrinds, the author says, as evolution might have developed them, would have been about as eager to waste their narrative efforts creating fables and fictions as they would have been to waste their manual labor in producing dull adzes. If this strict devotion to the truth, and with it a revulsion for a fantasy and fiction, had developed and had shown clear adaptive value in the Pleistocene, making the Gradgrinds our direct ancestors, then we would not be the people we are today. We could be expected to react to the known to be untrue stories and made-up fantasy, much as we react to uselessly dull knives, or worse, the smell of rotting meat, end quote, page 109. The fact is that every culture, without exception, loves fiction. And because fictions, quote, encourage us to explore the points of view, beliefs, motivations, and values of other human minds, they extend mind-reading capabilities and provide regulation for social behavior, end quote, even as they provide a, quote, vivid and memorable way of communicating information that likely had actual survival benefits in the Pleistocene, and most importantly, provide low-cost, low-risk surrogate experience, satisfying a need to experiment with answers to what-if questions that focus on the problems, threats, and opportunities life might have thrown before our ancestors. Fictions are preparations for life and its surprises, they say, end quote, page 110. It is here that Dutton comments on the work of neuroscientist Steven Pinker and echoes Isaac Asimov and explains why, if we are going to envision sustainability, we need fiction more than ever. He says, quote, the mind uses fiction to explore and solve life problems in the imagination. And Pinker says, quote, the cliche that life imitates art is true because the function of some kinds of art is for life to imitate it. The work we must do in this class is help you strengthen your childhood ability to decouple fantasy and reality through better use of your imagination. Precisely at a time in your life when, by entering the sciences and trying to battle fake news and the fictions of climate skeptics and business's usual techno-optimists, you thought you had mastered discernment of reality and truth because you were a good student all these years and always got the right answer on the exam. What I suspect most of you really did is merely strengthen your allegiance to the best dogma out there, allying yourself with the grad grinds and trying to shut out any cognitive dissonance that your tribe deems heresy. It is our field-tested belief that what you really need to do to envision sustainability is to start thinking like a child again and thinking out louder through lots of imaginative play, so that those highly evolved mechanisms can kick in once again, separating the pretend worlds from the real world with the same clarity you had as a child when you sat down to an imaginary tea party and your worried parents came over to ask, "Are you sure you know the difference between the hot water in the real teapot on the kitchen table that can burn you in real life and the invisible hot water that you are so meticulously pouring all over the heads of your imaginary rabbit friends in your game?" You were sure then, and you can be just as sure now that as you role-play your sustainable utopias, you will know which technologies may never come true and which are worth pursuing because they just might, if only you think and play a little more. Game on?